Hello, this is Benjamin Bagby, and I'm here today to talk about the early medieval harp. The kinds of harps that would have been played in Europe, especially north of the Alps, between the 6th or even 5th and 11th centuries. I have several instruments to show today and to compare the sounds, the tunings, and the shapes of these instruments. Basically, all of these harps, and I do call them harps even though we might say lyre today, because the word harp is a Germanic word which was used when referring to such instruments. All of these harps have a similar construction. They're made from a single piece of wood which has been opened up and hollowed out, quite thin actually, but not solid. It may look like a plank of wood, but it's actually hollowed out. You can hear the resonance body if I tap on the top, that it's hollow inside. Into this hollow body, onto this hollow body, the top is glued back down, and then the strings, which are normally 6 strings made of gut, are strung over a bridge made of wood or sometimes bone or any other hard material, even ember has been found. There's a tailpiece which is affixed to the end of the instrument and 6 pegs at the top. It couldn't be a more simple design. The wood of this particular instrument, which comes from a southern German excavation in Oberflacht, is, strangely enough, oak, which is not a typical wood for making harps, but all of the objects found in that burial site were made of oak. The tuning of this instrument can vary widely. There are very few indications about tunings of these instruments, but clearly with 6 strings and given string making technology of the 5th, 6th or 7th centuries, it's not going to be very high strings or very low strings, also given the vibrating length, which is not extreme by any means, and which is the same for all 6 strings. And so you can assume various things. One is that the strings are not tuned to the same note, but to different notes. In that case, there will be intervals which will result, and these intervals probably will not exceed an octave, given what we know about string technology. And so I took as a point of departure that the outside strings, 1 and 6, would be tuned in an octave. That leaves us with 4 strings in the middle, and these 4 strings have to be tuned in some kind of a relationship with strings 1 and 6. And knowing what we do about medieval ideas of harmony and consonance, it's very likely that these strings were tuned at the interval of a 5th with the octave strings. So I tune a 5th up from the lowest string. Here's the lowest string, and a 5th up above that. So I have this particular sounding 5th, which gives me automatically the 4th, the perfect 4th, between that new string and the top string. So I have a 5th and a 4th and an octave. I can perform the same operation on the top string, tuning a 5th down from that string. So I have this 5th, which gives me automatically the 4th with the lowest string. Now I have this sound, and I have 2 sounds now. I have this sound and this sound. One's featuring the 5th, and one's featuring the 4th with the 5th above, and here the 5th with the 4th above. So what's left are strings 2 and 5. Strings 2 and 5 can be quite varied. They can move around in various places. In this particular tuning, they also play a fifth, but it's a very different color from the principal strings, which are these 4 strings and these 2 strings. You can think of them in a way as different colors in the same mode. So with these 6 strings, and I'll play them one after the other now, give us an enormous amount of material. One would think intuitively this must be quite limiting, but it's actually not. It gives an enormous capability for pattern and variation. Just for playing melodies, or for playing patterns. Next, we'll look at some other instruments and see how they could be tuned in a different way and how they make different sounds. The next instrument is based on a harp found in a burial site from the 6th century in Trossingen in Germany in the Black Forest. This instrument was discovered only 20 years ago and has been restored very beautifully by the Archaeological Museum in Constance, where it can be seen today. Copies were made by the harp builder Rainer Thurau, who was given access to all of the materials relating to its construction. The most interesting thing about this instrument, although it's basically quite similar to the Oberflacht instrument, is that it has carvings, both on the front and the back. There are carvings showing warriors on the front, and on the back carvings showing Longobardic figures. These carvings are etched into the wood and give it a particular significance. Obviously, it was an instrument of great importance in the tribal culture in which it was used. This instrument is extremely delicate. It's not made of oak like the first instrument we saw, but made of maple. It's very, very light, hollow inside, of course. It also has some holes in the arms and in the body which may have served to attach a wrist strap here so that the player could hold the instrument by the wrist and also use the fingers to dampen strings in a strumming technique. So you damp strings and strum across the front with a plectrum or with the hand. That's one of the playing techniques. Now, this particular instrument I have tuned in one of the few tunings we can actually know from the Middle Ages, and that's a tuning from a monastic music book of Hucbald of Saint-Amand, who was writing in the 9th century and who gave us an instructional manual for learning Gregorian chant, which used a visualization of the harp in a horizontal position with the 6 strings visualized, on which he wrote syllables of the Gregorian chant to be sung. So a kind of primitive tablature resulted. It's not really musical notation, but simply shows which string. And he identifies the strings and shows the intervals at which they're tuned with one another. A whole step, a half step, and 2 more whole steps. And that gives us this particular tuning, whole step followed by whole step, followed by half step, and then 2 more whole steps. So we have this, which is a diatonic scale, let's say, based on C, although he doesn't make that particular note precise. He just says whole steps and half steps. This is a tuning which we know was used at least in the 9th century in a monastic context. Now, whether that was a tuning known for epic song or any kind of pagan culture, we cannot say, but it certainly was used in the process of using such an instrument as an instructional tool for teaching music to novices. There we see a kind of co-opting of the previous instrumental tradition into church music study, into the formation of young singers. Interesting about this tuning is it gives us a series of 3 perfect fourths. And these 3 perfect fourths, when they're perfect, give us many possibilities for performance and for accompanying song. This instrument has also a characteristic, which is that it's very soft and it plays in a lower register. You can't tune the strings up very high because the construction is so delicate that it would destabilize the wooden structure. Earlier I mentioned an instrument from Germany, from Oberflacht. That particular gravesite from the 7th century had in it 2 harps. The first one, which you saw at the beginning, and the second one looked more like this. This particular instrument has a more rounded shape. It's also somewhat wider, and it's somewhat more resonant. It's also quite thin, as you can see, and it has a similar construction to all of the others, with one exception. It has here a kind of secondary bridge across the top. Markings were found in the wood of the arms showing something had been inserted here on each side, and the builder, Rainer Thurau, thought that this could be a secondary bridge. That has the effect of making all the strings basically the same length, but also bringing all the strings into the same plane. They're absolutely in the same plane, no matter how they're wound on the pegs. This particular instrument, like all of the harps that have come to us, there might be as many as 15 fragments known, has no intact strings or tailpiece. Some of the instruments have intact pegs. This one had no bridge intact, but we can assume it was made of wood or a hard material such as bone. This particular one now I have tuned in a tuning related to the first one you heard. It still has the octave as the outside strings. So this, with the 5th tuned up and down from the bottom to the top, and from the top to the bottom. So these strings 1, 3, 4, and 6 are always 4ths and 5ths and octave, building a kind of harmonious and stable core for the tuning. The other 2 strings are also in a relationship of a perfect 5th, but it's positioned differently from the first instrument. So here's the secondary tone in a 5th, and the primary tone. Secondary one is this. That gives us these 6 tones. This is one of many possible tunings. I'm not saying that these are the only known tunings, but when you look at the various possibilities for 6 strings which are the same length, there are literally dozens of possibilities. And I don't think that there was any one standard tuning for this instrument. It probably varied from tradition to tradition, from place to place, and from master to student, was carried on in oral tradition until this particular instrument was supplanted, especially during the 11th and 12th centuries, by the triangular harp, which you see here. That's an instrument from the 12th century, and it certainly had more strings. The strings were not the same length. They were shorter or longer depending on the pitch, and it was a more versatile instrument which could be used in courtly music, whereas this comes from a more tribal culture where the instrument itself belongs to the singer who is telling stories.